On to the conversation at hand. I'll just take a minute to introduce Ms. Vanita Narayanan. Vanita is a senior global executive and a board leader with a successful track record in telecommunications and technology. In 2020, she retired after a career spanning nearly 3 decades at IBM, where she held a number of multiple key roles, leading large businesses in the US, Asia Pacific, and India. These roles included everything from serving as managing director and chairwoman of IBM India, vice president for communications across Asia Pacific, vice president for global telecommunications solutions, and finally managing director for another strategic telecom client before her retirement. She was named one of the most powerful women in business in India by both Fortune magazine and Business India, and one of the 12 global Indian superwomen in 2016. She currently serves on the board of directors of Renew Global Energy PLC, one of the first renewable power companies in India, HCL Technologies, and Schlumberger. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Vanita Narayanan to the stage.
Hello. Okay. Thank you.
So, Vanita, you have an incredible story, and I just want to jump right into it. And I'm hoping that through the course of our conversation, we will really get a glimpse into your entire journey, and more importantly, into all of the characteristics that defined you, which also defined your success. So I don't want to, there's just so much, so let's get started. So you've retired from IBM as the head of IBM India as chairwoman, and then also I think you held a number of other strategic roles in IBM as well right before retirement. And it's a technology firm, everybody knows it, International Business Machines, and yet you started off as a liberal arts major.
Yes.
With a degree in, I think, political science, advertising, and then I think you had an MBA in advertising and marketing.
Yes.
Which is a very unusual combination to retire as the head of a technology company. So can you tell us, how did you start and get to where you ended?
Well, when I headed IBM India, I would tell them I had to go to the US to get hired by IBM because India would not have hired me. So it was, you're right, back, I guess, 3 decades ago, 4 decades ago, particularly in India, you needed a technical degree to be hired by a technology firm. But I guess I was a bit of a contrarian, and anybody who grew up in India or has relatives in India, 4 decades ago, if you were a liberal arts major in India, you were somebody your parents worried about. So I decided to do liberal arts to frankly take revenge on my parents. They moved from Pune to Madras then, and I thought that was the end of my life as I would know it. So what better way for a Tambram to get back at her parents than to join liberal arts? So my mother could explain to every relative why I didn't do something that was in science or math. So we choose things for strange reasons, but probably was one of the best decisions of my life. In fact, I just wrote a blurb for the alumni magazine because Stella Maris, my alma mater, is 75 years old this year. And at a time when liberal arts wasn't really appreciated, my undergrad degree was in public relations and communication, which was one of the early degrees which gave you a vocational experience. So we did corporate internships and exposed us to a lot of working people. So it was an amazing education to get at that point in time. And later I discovered I do have an aptitude for quantitative things. So it wasn't something that completely shocked me. So when I moved to Houston, Texas in 1981, I started in a very different place because Houston, Texas in 1981 was not the technology capital or the marketing and advertising capital. And my first job was defined by how I could walk to it as opposed to what the job was about. So the only job I could get to was as a sales clerk at a department store called Josky's in Houston, Texas. So hence started my career 4 decades ago at $3.50 an hour.
So, the thing about liberal arts degrees is still true in the Indian community, even in the US. I'll just share a funny story. At my graduation, my dear uncle was visiting from India, and he goes, "Oh, they do give degrees for liberal arts majors." I was like, "Yes." And he goes, "And do they give you jobs too?" So it's still a thing. But anyway, so you started off selling televisions, if I'm not mistaken. Was it televisions at Josky's?
Towels.
Towels. And then you
I graduated. I moved my way up to commission selling.
Which was television?
Yes. My career progressed. It was first linens, then housewares, and then electronics, and that was the top of the pecking order. Yeah.
So you decided at one point that selling televisions wasn't going to be enough for you, and you decided to go to the University of Houston and pursue a second MBA.
Actually, I went back to the University of Houston, realizing that this was the early days in technology. So I thought, let me try computer programming. And so I took 2 classes, one in Fortran and one in COBOL, since we've already established how old I am. And I decided computer science was not for me. So I was going to go back to the business department, and rather than doing a degree again in marketing, I think I did my MBA in 13 months with a major in management information systems and accounting.
So how did you get from there to IBM? Because Houston is the oil and gas capital of the world.
Well, that's another sad story. So I, not the IBM part, but the oil and gas part. So I joined my MBA because this was the only way for somebody with a foreign name, foreign degree, no work experience, to get recruited. And back in those days, U of H would get everybody from Exxon, Shell, Pennzoil, Conoco, you name it. They came and everybody got recruited if you were any good. So therein, with, by then I was a mom with a little toddler, so here with lots of personal adjustments and sacrifices, go to University of Houston deciding that I'm going to get hired by one of these. And lo and behold, in 1987, I think gas was either at $17 a barrel or $18 a barrel, so nobody came to campus. So there ended the oil and gas dream. So 40 years later, I'm on the Schlumberger board, but that's, I happened to be sitting next to somebody, my first class, microeconomics, and she was a professional hire at IBM in St. Louis, Missouri, and she happened to give my resume to her boss, who called me, and I guess the rest was history.
So I'm curious, these days the average tenure of an employee, this is according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, is about 4.1 years at any given company. You spent 3 decades at IBM.
32 and a half years.
32 and a half years, yeah, that's a very long time. Why did you stay so long? What was it about IBM that made you want to stay?
If you ask my daughter, she'd say I'm a slow learner. And actually many things. Today we use phrases like, bring your whole self to work, be authentic. These are not phrases that we either knew or really comprehended 4 decades ago, and particularly as a first-generation immigrant. But when I was interviewing on campus, there were a few companies that came to campus, and one was, in fact, Arthur Andersen back then. And I remember wearing my only blue suit and going to the interview, and it was completely about this person who would one day be qualified to be partner. I never talked about the fact that I was married or I had a 3-year-old and it just scared the heck out of me. If, God forbid, I get this job, my husband was an auditor and he travels, how do we even? But at that point, it was about getting a job. So here I come home and Will Ulasek, the person who hired me from IBM, calls me and says, hey, Carolyn gave me your resume and we'd like you to go do a test. I did a test, fast forward, did well in the test. He calls me by the time I get home and say, can you show up for an interview? And I said, sure. So we had scheduled something a couple of weeks out. And my husband traveled all the time. Will calls me 2 days later and says, can you travel tomorrow? I know you were supposed to come, but we're going to have a hiring freeze, and we really would like to see you before the hiring freeze comes on. And he said, Carolyn tells me your husband travels all the time and you have a 3-year-old. So if you need to bring her with you, we will buy her ticket and we'll have Carolyn or somebody watch her while you interview. This is 1987. And fortunately, my husband happened to be in town and I did not have to travel with my 3-year-old for my first out-of-town job interview. And so immediately, you walk in and the first question, oh, did you have somebody to take care of her? You're put at rest completely because not only do they know who you are, they know what your constraints are. So I would say that probably, immediately set a very different tone for me because this company wanted me, not just what I could bring to them. And the rest of it, when I look at it, in terms of opportunities, I never was short of opportunities to grow. So even though I never switched jobs, every year I would write down something new that I needed to do the following year. Because again, as you went through those early days where people get laid off, because we were in Houston when, times when people got laid off. And this was not because you were good or not good. It was just because of the times. So it was about skills. So I always wanted to be sure that even though I'm in the same company, and yes, they wanted me, but I always was mentally prepared based on what I've done today, I'm good for another 2 years. So what do I do adding to my resume the next 2 years so I'm good for the next 2 years? So that was always my mindset. And I had the growth, I had great bosses, and it's a company that aligned with my values.
Yeah, that's, I think, a really important lesson. I really appreciate what you said there, and that's you were always preparing yourself to be valuable to the company, even though, they wanted you and all of you and all of that, and not just what you could bring to them, but you were also looking at what you could do to make sure that
Absolutely.
was an enriching exchange for both of you. So I think that's a really powerful lesson for all of us. So you took the job in St. Louis with IBM, you moved up to St. Louis, and then somehow you found your way back to Texas, as most people do. And so you get back to Texas, but you come back because of a client.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about that, and why did they call you specifically?
It's so I joined St. Louis IBM in the sales area as an industry specialist on a telecom client, Southwestern Bell back then, and IBM wanted people to focus on industry depth, and I was one of the early recruits, so I never joined on the technology side. It was about learning, and my client taught me the industry because there was not a lot of places you went to learn about a client's industry back in those days, and as a trainee, you can't do much damage because you're not doing much business in their industry. You're doing it in the data centers. So people let me have, I could basically go talk to any client I wanted. And if you were committed and you wanted to do right by them, people are so happy to teach you, right? And I was a sponge. So as I grew in the business and started work, everything I did was on the network side, for those of you that know telecom, on the network side of the business. And eventually, when our relationship with the client kept growing and they moved their headquarters back to Texas, we wanted somebody more senior on the team to be located in Texas, closer to the client. And at that point, I guess I was sort of nominated. I was always close to the client, and in Texas, it sort of afforded for us, my husband and I. My husband followed me to St. Louis and followed, again, we moved back to Dallas. So we decided, San Antonio was a bridge too far. Dallas would be good for both of us to move. So that's when we got back to Dallas in 1998.
How did you deliver customer satisfaction to that client in a way that made you the obvious choice to help lead this very important relationship, which is AT&T now? What do you think it was that made you the one?
I wouldn't say I was the one. I was, because I had a fantastic boss who in fact retired from IBM, heading that client for 40 years. So he stayed with the client all that time. And he was actually at my retirement Zoom call 4 decades later. I think it's very simple. And sometimes life has a funny way of helping you learn certain things. On the sales floor at Joski's, it's as close as you come to a client and you close a transaction and you listen. And I used to have, I'm going to deviate here, but I remember one day this little old lady, who walked in, and I said, "Ma'am, may I help you?" And she says, "Can I have somebody who speaks English that can come and help me?" And I said, "I'd love to help you, and let me try, and if I can't, I'll get somebody else too." And what I realized is, at the end of the day, she was like, "Thank you, honey, God bless you." But it was about 2 or 3 things. One, I had to slow down so that I could speak and be understood. So it wasn't about the fact that I knew or I could, add well in my head. I needed to communicate so that my customer or my client can actually understand me and not be uncomfortable trying to understand me. So it is, I think I always try to find a way of understanding my client's context so that they don't have to bridge to me, I bridge to them. And it's good for all relationships, but particularly for a client who's going to spend either their time with you or their money with you or both. And I think that's something that I learned, and maybe that's where not just my Joski's, but my public relations and communications experience helps as well. And the second thing is, just being incredibly honest. I remember we had a very difficult project where we missed multiple deadlines, and I didn't like the facts. So then I would tell my client, "I'm going to give you a date for a date because I've committed to dates that I can't keep. So at best, I'm going to give you a date, and I'll go talk to my team, and then I'll come and give you a date." So it was very important to me that any promises I made were promises kept, so that was part of your. So it was simple things, but I think that's something that I valued. And end of the day, every company is about the clients that you have. So for me, clients mattered. They sort of came first in my pecking order.
Yeah, that's great advice. So you ended up heading up this large client portfolio with AT&T, SBC, and then AT&T down the road. And then eventually you get, again, pointed to when IBM was looking to expand or launch the telecom business in India. So tell us a little bit about, again, why you, and what made you the preferred choice in that situation as well.
So we had a large client, and I wasn't heading the AT&T client, but I had a good role with that client, and as part of the global solutions team by then. And India was just growing at that point in time, so it was the whole telecom revolution in India, and 2G and wireless were all budding. And we needed somebody, and a consultant had done a market assessment study for us. So they needed someone who knew us as a company and knew our industry to go validate that plan. and it was a 3-year, $100 million plan. It's, years ago, so I can talk about the numbers now. And at that point in time, 3 years, 100 million, going from zero was a material number. So when my boss asked me, by then I was working for somebody else, the general manager for Global Telecom. I said, Mike, you do understand I don't know India from a work perspective. When I'm in India, I'm a daughter-in-law, I'm a sister. I have never worked in India. And he said, you know us, you know our industry, and you'll still be more sensitive and understand the local environment better than if I send somebody else. So that pretty much was sent me there. So I went there and met every client over the next 2.5 months, recruited our first early team there. And we had so I became sort of a mentor to the India team, besides doing the market assessment, and tremendous credit to the team. And we had a wonderful journey with telecom in India.
So you went to India, you were there for a few months, you added value there, you came back, and then you were later sent to China to head up the Asia Pacific telecommunications group for IBM.
Yes.
And if I recall correctly, that was one of the most challenging roles that you had up until that point, I think.
That would be true, yes. I came back from India, I had a couple of executive promotions, life was good, traveled out of Dallas all the time globally, and my daughter went to Plano West, and then to UT. So it was comfortable, and I was used to the rigor, and we had a new general manager who headed the sector, not just telecom, but all of what we call the communications sector. And he calls me one Friday and he says, I'd like you to go, head our business in Asia Pacific. And at that point it was Japan, Korea, Greater China, ASEAN, India, and Australia, New Zealand. So geography was a fair bit of geography. And I go, Gary, that's sort of, not what we... No, take your time. You've got all weekend. Talk to Ramesh about it. You can let me know Monday. So that was like a long time to think about it. And it just was one of those things where, to be honest, my in-laws happened to be visiting then. And my father-in-law was so excited about it. He's like, you should go. And my husband sort of, a little more thoughtful. But his reaction was, if you think you want to do this, you should, because, and in fact, early on, I wasn't sure that we would move as a family. In fact, I had this ridiculous idea that maybe I could just commute to Shanghai and Asia and, somehow manage that. And fortunately, I had a senior leader who said, don't make the mistake. If you're going, go as a family, or at least go as a unit. My daughter by then was graduating. And I'm glad for that advice. She said, because she did a tour of duty in Europe. She said, I was in Europe and the US, and it was hard. So if you're in Shanghai and here, it's not practical. And my husband's reaction was, you know what, every move we've made has been a good move for us as a fammy, so let's go. Mm-hmm.
So what? Oh,
no, yes, it was all him.
But once you got there, what made it challenging?
There are multiple things. One, I think the most challenging was, if I'm, being a little facetious, but also true, was managing my team in Japan. When you're a 40-something Indian woman with 60-something Japanese males, you quickly learn the meaning of the word passive-aggressive. And so that was probably the most challenging team, to manage. But there's the language. There are 2 or 3 things. One, the geography is a little overwhelming because it's a lot of travel. But there are a few other things that I think you assume. And I thought I was very global. I led a global team before I went there. I had global role. And then you realize that you are, when you spend the time with the team in Korea or China or Japan, you are so biased to listening to people who speak the loudest and people who speak English. So how you understand requirements, how you understand issues is far easier when you're in your time zone, and how difficult it is when you've got somebody from Korea who's trying to explain to you really, really important things at a time that's ridiculous for them in a language that they don't think or speak in. So one, it was about earning trust with each of the different teams, because Australia and New Zealand is very different and equally challenging in a very different way than Japan. India had its own sort of completely different dynamic. So every geography had its own culture, had its own way of working. And when you're running a role which is sort of, a headquarters sort of role, even though it's a regional role, you can't be everything to everyone. So it's also about figuring out how do you add value so you're not stepping on them and not trying to be everything to everybody. So I think figuring those things out and not just having a one size fits all and being credible, I think was definitely a learning experience.
Yeah. I can imagine that it would be challenging. And it's not just language, it's also cultures.
Yes.
It's cultural nuances that change from country to country in the region. I can imagine that being very, very different. But then you came back at one point, and then eventually you're promoted, I think, a few more times, and then sent to India, or you were sent to India as
from Shanghai.
Shanghai, okay, to become the chair, or in a different capacity first, and eventually promoted up to chair of IBM India, chairwoman. And then you were left to then run IBM's operations in India with 130,000 employees reporting to you. And I'm wondering, how did you find India now? So the first time you were there only for a few months.
Yeah.
And now you're there, you're in charge of everything. How was it? How was India?
Different. I left India in 1981 and moved back to India in 2009. So 28 years. Funny story, the first time I entered IBM India, the Bombay office, there's this smart young lady who walks up and says, and she says, "Hello, ma'am." So immediately, you're sort of, first time somebody's calling me ma'am, and so that sort of takes you back. And then she asked me, "When did you leave India?" I said, 81. "Oh my God, I was 2 years old then." So something that would happen only in India. So that was sort of welcome back to India. And it was different. So fortunately, I didn't go back to India to head India. I went back to India in what the company was trying to do as a general management head of sales role, and they wanted somebody to handle sales for all of the country. That allowed me to get to know the country and the clients, because it's one thing to have to be an expat in China, and you are an expat. They know you're an expat. When you go back to India looking the way you do, and Vanita Narayanan, you are expected to be local, but from my perspective, I worked and thought American. And my entire way of working and thinking was different. My communicating was different. So there were a lot of subtle differences in terms of how I needed to learn and adjust. Many things I learned, some things I didn't change, but it was a couple of jobs before I headed IBM India. And so that, I think, gave me a little bit of the runway to both earn my team's, if you will, trust and respect, as well as understand the clients and the market.
So one of the things I found really interesting when we talked about your time in India is you said you chose almost never to wear Indian attire, but you almost always wore pantsuit.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
That's because I can't wear a sari gracefully. And and my mother would be mortified if she was here. She says, how can somebody be 50 years old and not? You used to wear it when you went to college. I said, that was 4 decades ago. And it was, and when I'm working, I'm sort of working. And I didn't want to be worried about, whether my sari was right or whether I would trip over myself so it's like putting on the uniform for me. So when all I had to decide is this going to be a navy blue shoe week where I pack in grays and blues, or is this a brown shoe week, and throw my stuff in, and this is, so I'm in my work mode, and that's the way it is. And it made me comfortable in who I was so that my focus could be on what I did.
Makes a lot of sense. So there were...
I hope it wasn't for the fact that I don't wear saris well.
So there were 3 things that we talked about when we were speaking before that were very, very striking to me. So I want to end with the 3 questions that came to mind. The first one is, when we were preparing our conversation, you mentioned you actually didn't consider yourself very ambitious.
No.
And you said you were very much a head down, very focused individual, focused on your work, driven more by what you were doing and how well you were doing it, and not necessarily by a promotion or getting to another level. And I found that very interesting because last year when we hosted Mandy Ginsberg, who is the CEO of Match.com, a $22 billion company, she said something very, very similar. And I found that very striking. So I wanted to ask you, do you think ambition is important, or do you think competence alone is sufficient?
That's an interesting question. I think you have to have pride in what you do. And the reason I say I wasn't ambitious is it appears, people would ask me, how did you, do you plan on this? I hadn't planned on any job that I would have. Because if you look at my background, and from, somebody who came to Houston in the 1980s when inflation was the highest and, joined in the worst oil crisis, we were looking for security. So for me, it was always about, we as a dual income family would have security, job security. And as a first generation, set of immigrants with no safety nets, it was about building a level of, a safety net for ourselves. And then once you start to do anything, I think you want to do it to your satisfaction. And you have to have pride in what you do. And so for me, it was never about somebody, I don't want to disappoint my boss. It was never that I was ever afraid of a boss or feared a boss. It was, I hated the thought of letting down one of my bosses. So it was about, always wanting to do well and not letting them down. So it was a different, and I'll tell you one story which is important because I was sent for some executive senior leadership development, and the reason I say I was ambitious, I was clueless that it was a leadership development event and why I was sent to it. And then later I had an executive interview with back then the number 2 person for the IBM company, a wonderful executive, Doug Elex. And he had been given my background or my executive profile, but I had no idea why I was meeting Doug. And so when he asked me he said, so what would you like to do next? I had no idea. I said, you know what? I've never thought about it, because every time, somebody just tells me this is what they want me to do next, and that's what I did. And Doug looked at me, and he could have immediately said, oh my God, she's clueless. and written up on my, and sent it back, his response was, good for you. There are too many people walking around worried about the next job that they forget to do the one they have. And, that stuck with me. So it wasn't just the fact that I was focused. I think the fact that somebody gave me that feedback also influenced how I looked at people later. So if I had somebody that constantly came to me asking me about the next job, it sort of turned me off. And it was, do the job that you have.
Yeah. So another very interesting thing, and I think this is going to be my last question so we can open it up to the floor. Something else I found really interesting is you mentioned that you intentionally chose to limit your social circle to just a couple of families. And you engaged with them regularly, but you really didn't socialize a whole lot, particularly with the broader Indian community or the broader community. And it's interesting because this is a theme very similar to something David Lippman said at our 2016 technology conference. And he just said, my wife hated the fact that I never showed up to anything. And I'm wondering, do you think that limiting your social network allowed you to focus, which allowed you to rise? Or do you think that this was more of a personal preference and may or may not have had an impact on your career?
Yeah, I don't know that there's a correlation or a causation there. It's just the number of cycles you had and how you chose to spend it. My husband and I have one daughter, and it was important that, in fact, after you and I spoke, I called my daughter and I said, growing up, did you think I was a good mother? And she said, why are you asking me this? I said, I'm going to go, sit on stage and if you thought I, whatever, I don't, I want to sort of have, she says, no. She says, as a mother now, I can appreciate what you went through with dad traveling and you traveling. And she says, I don't know that you were the most fun, but because you were always preoccupied, and I could see that you were always preoccupied with either, but I think for you, the way that you wanted to be a good mom was you always cooked for us. Anytime, every time you were home, it was always a good meal that you put on the table, and I know that, and you did. So it was about all the care and feeding and all that, first generation, hearing my mother and my mother-in-law in my ears going, feed them well. And so it's sort of those sorts of things, and I found that early on, if I went to a set of parties where you met a lot of people, and then you invited them all, and then you cooked all weekend for all of them, and it was not something. Those were days when we couldn't afford catering or anything else, so it was more about let me get my weekend to organize myself for the week, so that I'm prepared, and to the extent that we could take our daughter for swim lessons or tennis lessons or whatever it is we were doing, or cleaning the house or whatever that might have been. That's how we chose, and as a family we like to travel. So if we had that space, our way of sort of enjoying ourselves was traveling as a family. So large social networks wasn't my thing.
Yeah, I can tell you as the daughter of a professional mother that today I really appreciated her example, even if she wasn't there for like every tennis match or whatever. Yeah. But the example of her rising up and her teaching me as she was learning along the way herself in her own journey, I think those to me were some of the most powerful lessons I learned in leadership and everything else that I developed and am still developing. So I think I'm sure you taught a lot by example.
I hope.
Well, I want to open it up to audience Q&A. I do have more questions, but I want to give all of you an opportunity to ask as well. So I think Anu, you can take the mic from me.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today. You've been so inspiring, and I really appreciate both Neil and you, Vanita, for taking the time to be present with us. I really appreciated what you said about getting the feedback that you did not have to think too far into the future. So I appreciate so much you demonstrating how to be in the present moment. I think we always are forgetting that the present moment is where we are right now. So thank you for demonstrating that despite whatever position that we are in, that to relish that and to appreciate it is so important. I think that's a huge lesson for all of us. And you really did demonstrate that, and that really gives us great pause to understand that. So thank you. The other question that I had for you was, you had said that it's important to put the client first. That is something that you understood very early on, and so appreciating that. But where in the journey did you understand that at some point you had to put yourself first for your self-care? Did you ever consider that? And was that something that you understood inherently that had to be done? Because many of us are helping others that are broken down. You know, if we're in healthcare, like myself, we're seeing the person, especially women, they're very hard on themselves. And the first question I often ask of them is, when will you put yourself first?
You know, that's a tough question. If I answered it very honestly, it would be, I started putting myself first when I retired 2 years ago, which is not a good answer. But I'll tell you, when I retired, I suddenly had no excuses either. It wasn't the client, because by then I wasn't raising a family, I wasn't traveling, I controlled, and COVID, you know, and I retired to travel, but then we had COVID, so I could cook for ourselves. We didn't have to, you know, I wasn't on a plane all the time. And, you know, I managed to lose a lot of weight, I managed to get healthy, and I managed to get, so, but if I go back and answer honestly, when you think about it, it depends on what role you have. It's your people, your employees, because as you start to rise in leadership, you worry about your people, your talent, your family, obviously, always. You don't get to do over, you know, with your family. And, but through this all, I would not be honest if I didn't say that I had a very supportive family. My parents, my husband, my in-laws. So in a way, they took care of me. And I think when you don't focus on yourself, but if you're fortunate enough and blessed enough to have people around you that sort of care for you. So I may not have done it in a conscious way, but I think my tribe took care of me. So, but it is, I think you make a very important point.
She actually took my question, but I'll ask you another one. Firstly, thank you so much. What an amazing journey. You're an inspiration.
Well, thank you.
As you went through your journey, I'm sure there probably were times when you could not go on anymore. How did you move yourself past that?
Oh, wow. It was in, we were still in St. Louis, and I was on a trip to Dallas, at one of the hotels in downtown Dallas. And when I told you about being honest with your client, we had this huge meeting with the client the next day. They had, you know, convened about 40 or 50 of their people that were going to be there. And my development team tells me, we're not going to deliver. So I'm in tears, you know, just completely in tears. And I, you know, call my manager in St. Louis and my boss, and I say, you know, how do I face them again? They're all here, and we've got these commitments we made. And he said, you know, it must have been, you know, 11:30 at night or whatever, way before cell phones. And he said, I want you to take a deep breath and go wash your face, drink a glass of water, call me back. So I did that. And he says, you know, Vanita, you can only be asked to do your best and be honest. The sun is going to rise in the east tomorrow morning. I promise you that. So, you know, on the worst of nights or on the most difficult days, you know, I'd always say, you know what, I've got my health, my family's got their health, and the sun will rise tomorrow morning. And I always remember Rick's words. And by nature, I am somebody who just plows through. It's not, I compartmentalize. So if I have a problem in one space, I don't let it bleed into everything. So my mother was in ICU in Bangalore, and I was in the office. Now, the only person who knew was my assistant, because my, you know, in the ICU, you're not allowed to be there. My office was 10 minutes away from the hospital. So rather than me stand in the corridor over there, not doing anything, I was sitting in my office running cadences, but if I needed to, I could be there. So I guess very early on, I learned to compartmentalize. So when I have a problem in one space, I try to move to another space and solve something and feel that I can empower myself, if you will, and not feel helpless. Yeah.
So I think we are out of time for today, and I just want to say thank you so much for being with us and for sharing your experiences and really your insights on how to be a great leader and how to rise, especially through trying and challenging times. So you've really helped us to understand what it can mean to redefine success. And with that, I want to ask everyone to give me, to join me in giving Vanita a round of applause.
I just want to say thank you. And this is the largest group I've seen in Dallas since being back. We came back in the midst of COVID. So, no, thank you all and wish you all the very best. And thank you for having me here. It's been a pleasure and a privilege. And thank you, Niti. Thank you, Neil.
It's our privilege. Thank you. Thank you, Neil and Vanita. That was amazing. So touching. You know, 3 decades with the same company, that's unfounded. But, you know, it sounds like IBM took all of you and you gave all to IBM. I mean, that's loyalty. That's loyalty. That's amazing on both sides, right? Thank you again. That was amazing.